Welcome to the latest instalment of Close Readings, part of a series called Love and Death, in which we are looking at the great tradition of elegies written in English. My name is Seamus Perry, and I teach English at Balliol College in Oxford, and I'm talking, as always, to Mark Ford, poet, critic, and professor of English at University College, London. We decided to go about this series of conversations in a thematic rather than a chronological way, and our subject today is elegies written in memory of family members, brothers, parents, children, and we're going to range all the way from the Romantic period down through to poems published in the 2010s. And the poem we thought we'd start with, Mark, is Wordsworth's wonderful poem, the slightly prosaic title, Elegiac Stanzas Suggested by a Picture of Peele Castle, but a very powerful memorial poem for his dead brother John.
It's quite oblique, though, isn't it? It's very different from some of the elegies that we've looked at, and that you don't realise it is an elegy until about 2/3 of the way through. And the first thing you notice about it is an ekphrastic poem, which is a poem about a painting, and it's really quite important to see the painting in relation to the poem. It's by a friend of Wordsworth, Sir George Beaumont, and it's of this ruined castle which is near Furness in so west of the Lake District and
Lancashire coast.
Yeah, and Wordsworth stayed in Rampside near there in July of 1794, which is what he describes in the first part of the poem. And the first part of the poem describes the weather during that period of July 1794, which coincidentally was when the kind of Robespierre dies in that period, and it was a period of great sort of political turmoil. But the weather was terrific. The weather was absolutely wonderful. Everything anyone walking in the Lake District would dream of for the period that he stayed with Dorothy in 1794. That it's a lovely glassy sea, that every day is sunny, and the picture by George Beaumont is of Peele Castle in the most enormous storm. It's being buffeted by winds and waves, and there's a boat just off the shore which is getting a battering, and the clouds are lowering, and it is very much the opposite of the way the weather was when he stayed there. And, of course, the elegiac aspect of the poem is that it is commemorating the death of his younger brother, John. He was 2 years younger, I think. And John was a sea captain, and his ship, the Earl of Abergavenny, had foundered off Portland in February of 1805, and John was the captain who stayed at his post, and he wasn't one of those who survived the wreck. I think about half of the people on board did survive the wreck, but he didn't. And this was, what was the effect of it on the Wordsworths? Pretty bad, wasn't it?
Well, we need to explain how John fits into the Wordsworth circle, I suppose. The Wordsworth children are all separated in childhood, and Dorothy and William get back together again by the end of in the last years of the 18th century, but they don't really get reacquainted seriously with John until he comes to stay with them in 1800 in Grasmere. So just when William and Dorothy are creating Dove Cottage and creating the whole, I don't mean this in a pejorative way, the whole myth of Dove Cottage and Grasmere for themselves, then John turns up and is automatically a part of it. And I think his role is much more important probably than it's easy to show biographically, because it was partly perspective. I think you're quite right to say that he's a sailor, but he's a merchant sailor. He's an employee of the East India Company, and he's making money. And it's pretty clear if you read some of the letters that the plan is that he's going to make lots of money and come back and join the Grasmere Circle. And, William and Dorothy are pretty poor. And John has clearly volunteered to do this to support William's creative career. So when he goes down on the Earl of Abergavenny, it's not just the loss of a brother of whom they were very fond, but it's also the loss of a whole, as it were, life project that, as just gone down beneath the waves.
Yes, and they lost their parents young, didn't
Yeah.
they? I think was it Wordsworth 8 when his mother died, 13 when his father
That's
died.
right.
So there was a kind of an orphan aura which the kind of Wordsworths endured, and the sibling bonds were very strong. I mean, we should perhaps say before looking at elegiac stanzas how important elegy is to the whole Wordsworthian project, that many of his most powerful poems involve quite inexplicable deaths. I'm thinking of the Lucy poems and the Matthew poems. She dwelt among the untrodden ways beside the springs of Dove, a maid whom there were none to praise and very few to love, and so on. And at the end of those, Lucy dies, and whether Lucy is a version of Dorothy Wordsworth in her innocence or whatever, there's a sense in which those poems, like elegiac stanzas, the trajectory of them is from innocence through some kind of fall, analogous to the fall in Paradise Lost, involved by eating the apple, into some kind of experience which is grim and difficult and involves death. And there's a kind of sense of the posthumous for the survivor of those Lucy poems, and the break made in the life, but oh, the difference to me. I mean, in a way, that sums up the whole of this poem, doesn't it? The elegiac stanzas, the difference before and after John's death. So in terms of the narrative the poem presents, it is quite analogous to one which was kind of hardwired into Wordsworth's sense of his own poethood, which involved this transition from a state of kind of tranquility or innocence, or in this case it may be a transference of his own trauma or frozen state that he'd kind of been plunged into by the death of John, into a kind of sense of the sufferings of humanity, which makes you a great tragic poet, is the notion, because you've suffered in some way, and makes you a finer and deeper and more Shakespearean kind of bard. But the loss is also quite extreme.
Yes, and there are probably two other things we should mention. One is that when Wordsworth, before John's death, tries to characterize him in verse, he calls him a silent poet. So he's not a poet, he doesn't write, but Wordsworth wants to attribute to him, or wants to identify within him, as it were, the seeds of a similar kind of poetic vocation to that which Wordsworth himself has. So as in lots of the elegies that we've been talking about in this series, there's an element of auto-elegy, a kind of covert auto-elegy going on. And the other thing to mention, which I think is only peripherally relevant to the poem, but is there somewhere, I think, is that John's death is extraordinarily brave. So he stays, by all reports, he stays on board the boat, the ship, until the very end. He ensures that as many people are saved as can be saved. And then, at least according to the report that Coleridge heard some months later, his last words were, "I have done my duty, let her go." So there's an astonishing sense of a moral vocation or a moral principle being brilliantly fulfilled, which is to do with duty or the fulfilling of your duty. Coleridge, of course, it's very hard to do this at the moment because the Coleridge's notebooks are in the British Library. But if you ever get the chance to look at the originals, as it were, of Coleridge's notebooks, this is an extraordinary page. He receives the news in Malta. He writes this heartfelt thing about John Wordsworth drowning. And the page is splotted with his teardrops because he's so moved by these words of John Wordsworth before the ship goes down. I've done my duty, let her go.
It's interesting that Wordsworth's approach is so oblique, isn't it?
Yeah.
That John only figures only by reference,
Yes.
2/3 the way through the poem.
Yes.
So it's almost as if he can't bear to
face it full frontal, as it were.
And he did want to write an elegy straight after, but couldn't. He was
couldn't do it,
completely traumatized by it. And also that he doesn't make him into a hero figure in the way in which Yeats made the Irish Airman into a hero figure.
Yes,
that he doesn't characterize him, but it proceeds in this very oblique, elliptical way, but it builds up to a final sentence, a final line, which is absolutely overpowering. Let me read the first 5 or 6 stanzas, which recreates this idyllic, perfect stay in Rampside in 1794 by the side of Peele Castle. And we should say that Wordsworth sees the picture by Sir George Beaumont of Peele Castle in this terrible storm in the spring of 1806, after the year after John has died, and manages to use it to write an elegy for John based on the contrast between the kind of brilliant weather of 1794 and the terrible weather depicted in Sir George Beaumont's picture. I was thy neighbour once, thou rugged pile. 4 summer weeks I dwelt in sight of thee. I saw thee every day, and all the while thy form was sleeping on a glassy sea. So pure the sky, so quiet was the air, so like, so very like was day to day. Whene'er I looked, thy image still was there. It trembled, but it never passed away. How perfect was the calm! It seemed no sleep, no mood which season takes away or brings. I could have fancied that the mighty deep was even the gentlest of all gentle things. Ah, then, if mine had been the painter's hand to express what then I saw, and add the gleam, the light that never was, on sea or land, the consecration and the poet's dream. I would have planted thee, thou hoary pile, amid a world how different from this, beside a sea that could not cease to smile, on tranquil land, beneath a sky of bliss. So different from this is the first indication that he's looking at a picture. So that's referring to the kind of stormy weather in the George Beaumont picture.
Yes, it's a very striking passage, isn't it? Because you have this experience being praised, being revered, being looked upon in this highly valued way for its sameness. So very like was day to day. The image trembled but never passed away. So already in a very kind of subtle way, Wordsworth is weaving into the poem, isn't he, the idea of temporality and the passing of time as being something which is destructive. But otherwise, this is a very unromantic way of praising experience, that it's the same. Yesterday is exactly the same as today, is exactly the same as tomorrow.
It's complete suspension, isn't it? And it's really interesting when we come on to the Denise Riley to see how she creates similar or analogous states of suspension. This suspension is almost post-traumatic, or it's deriving back from the trauma of the loss and recreating this state in one which is a mixture of innocence and bliss, but one which is the kind of atemporal, which is characteristic of the experience of grief. So it's a really complicated approach, I think, to the elegy. How much Wordsworth is conscious of this as he's setting about it. In a way, Denise Riley is very, very conscious of every move she makes in that poem. You don't feel that Wordsworth is particularly in this recreation of those idyllic 4 weeks with Dorothy in Rampside back in 1794, and the rugged pile, which is the castle, this ruined castle, becomes a version of the romantic picturesque, isn't it? It looks beautiful.
Yes, that's right.
It's
like a Claude painting or something.
And it's Tintern Abbey, sort of similar. It's a similar experience to Tintern Abbey, and this is the picture which were he a painter. So we get this very peculiar kind of surmise going on that he would, if he had been a painter, he would have painted Peele Castle in this gloriously sunny, timeless moment. Very different from the one which he then confronts when he sees Sir George Beaumont's picture, when the winds are howling and the rains are pouring down, and somehow in a storm, you're all very aware of time, aren't you, and of vulnerability and of human mortality.
Thanks for listening to this extract from Close Readings. You can listen to the full episode and all our other Close Readings series by signing up to our Close Readings subscription. If you're listening in Apple, you can do that just by going to the top of this podcast, or for Spotify and other podcast apps, go to lrb.me/audio or click on the link in the description.